Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Michelle Benjamin from Leasecake. I'm the Vice President of Marketing. We're so happy to have you. We're here to talk about tenant improvement allowances today, which is a great, exciting topic. It could mean lots of money back for your business, which I think is why there's so many people registered, because it's the opportunity to get lots of money back. So we're going to dive into that. Before we do, while we're waiting for people to join, just a few housekeeping items, the same questions I get every time. I'm happy to answer them every time for you. We are recording this and I'll be sending it out to everybody afterwards, just in case you missed something or want to share it with a colleague or just listen later. We have the deck also, and I'm happy to share that as well if you're interested in watching it or looking through it on your own time. And we have two ways for you to ask questions. You can send them over via the chat or the Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye on those while Tina is speaking, and we will do a Q&A at the end. But feel free to send them over at any time. We're happy to see what questions you have. And with that, I will introduce our speaker, Tina Colucci. You may be familiar with her if you work with Leasecake already. She's one of our amazing real estate managers, and she's here to talk to us all about tenant improvement allowances. Tina, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for everybody that joined. I'm hoping that we can provide some value to you in this presentation. So let's just jump right in, starting with what is a tenant improvement allowance. Pretty basically speaking, it's kind of known as a TIA for short, because tenant improvement allowance is a mouthful, but it's an incentive some landlords offer in commercial lease of office, retail, or warehouse space. The allowance outlines the construction costs the landlord's willing to cover in preparation for tenant use and is spelled out in the lease or company amendments. So what's included in your tenant improvement allowance? It typically covers a wide range of improvements needed to make the lease space functional and tailored to the tenant's specific business needs. The type of improvements covered by the allowance generally focus on the interior build-out of the space and can include partition walls, building or removing interior walls to create offices, kitchens, or other required spaces. Flooring, installation of carpet, tile, hardwood, or other types of flooring. Ceilings, installing drop ceilings, acoustic panels, or any other modifications to the ceiling needed for lighting or HVAC. Wiring and outlets, new electrical wiring or additional power outlets to accommodate equipment, appliances, and technology. Lighting fixtures, installing or upgrading lighting systems, including energy efficient options or specialized lighting to enhance the space's aesthetic. Restroom fixtures, adding or renovating restrooms, including sinks, toilets, and plumbing systems. Kitchen and break room plumbing, including plumbing for sinks, kitchens, or other facilities. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, upgrading or installing HVAC systems to ensure comfort and compliance with safety regulations. Paint and wall coverings, interior painting or adding wallpaper or other surface treatments. Trim and molding, installing or upgrading baseboards, crown molding, or other decorative finishes. Built-in furniture, installation or custom cabinetry, counters, or other built-in furniture needed for the operation of the business. Retail displays, fixtures specific to retail operations, such as shelves or display cases. Accessibility improvements, ensuring space complies with the Americans with Disabilities Act, such as installing ramps, wider doorways, or other accessible features. Sprinkler systems, installing or updating fire sprinkler systems to meet local codes. Fire alarms and exit signage, installation of fire alarms, extinguishers, and exit signage as required by safety regulations. Signage, this is going to be just in some cases. It may include allowances for branded signage inside the lease space, such as menus, wayfinding signs, or logo displays. That's not typical, and this is something we'll kind of touch on kind of throughout this presentation. Is landlords typically don't pay for anything that's too tenant specific or branded, so signage is one of those questionable items. but we put it on the list anyway. Sorry. Next. Tenant-controlled TI versus a landlord-controlled TI. In a landlord-controlled tenant improvement, the landlord manages the architectural and construction services using their standard options in line with the landlord's financial health and the building's class and appearance. However, tenants can negotiate upgrades before the project begins. This process provides tenants with a turnkey solution, delivering a finished space upon possession. Tenants often prefer the landlord-controlled TI due to the landlord's experience with similar projects, knowledge of the building, and established relationships with contractors and vendors. The landlord is responsible for completing the work within the budget outlined in the lease agreement. If the costs exceed the budget, the landlord covers the overages. However, if the project comes in under budget, the landlord retains the excess funds. In a tenant-controlled TI agreement, the tenant manages the project, giving them more control over every step. The tenant typically selects their own architect and contractors, though landlords can provide recommendations. The architect creates the plans, which usually requires landlord approval. Tenants may hire a project management firm to oversee these projects, handling communication with contractors and the landlord for approvals and updates. Any changes to the original plans must be submitted to the landlord to avoid delays in the reimbursement process. The primary advantage of a tenant-controlled TI is the ability to maximize the use of the budgeted funds and maintain full project control, but this often requires a significant upfront capital investment.
Right. Who pays for them?
That is the question now, isn't it? Now, one big difference in the different types of tenant improvement allowances is who pays upfront. In a landlord-controlled TI, the landlord pays for and manages the entire project, and the tenant receives a finished product. The tenant doesn't have to pay upfront, but has limited control over the process. In a tenant-controlled TI, the tenant pays upfront for the improvements, manages the project, and is later reimbursed by the landlord for the agreed-upon amount. The tenant has more control, but must handle the financial and project management aspects. If it's a tenant-controlled TI and there's a reimbursement, the reimbursement can either be paid in cash, maybe in one lump sum at the end of the project, or there could be a stipulation for progress payments, or sometimes it can be offered as a rent credit.
Does one of these happen more often than the other? Or is it just preference to the landlord, Tina? Just out of curiosity.
Just out of curiosity, I'd say reimbursement is the one that we see most often.
So the landlord doesn't have to pay up front.
They don't pay up front. The landlord pays for everything when the project is done. They've got their receipt, they've got the required documentation as stated in the lease. Then the landlord will reimburse them for the amount of
Cool. Sounds like a landlord. That makes sense.
How much is my tenant improvement allowance? Landlords determine the amount of a tenant improvement allowance by considering many factors, including the length of the lease, the age and condition of the building, other occupants, the size and condition of the unit, and market conditions. The tenant improvement allowance is usually calculated and presented in dollars per square foot. So for example, if the allowance is $22 per square foot and the space is 3,500 square feet, the landlord agrees to pay up to $77,000 for the project. To determine if a tenant improvement allowance is sufficient, the tenant should work with one or two contractors to get a preliminary bid for the desired renovations. Can I negotiate my tenant improvement allowance? The short answer is yes. They are negotiable, but they are just one part of the total lease package. We'll dive into some of the key factors that influence negotiating in the next slide, but want to note here that tenant improvement allowance should be part of the initial lease negotiation process and not an afterthought. The earlier you can discuss this, the more leverage you have before committing to other terms like rent, lease duration, and renewal options. landlords are more likely to accommodate requests for allowances before major terms are finalized. So ensure it's part of the conversation from the start. When negotiating your tenant improvement allowance, the objective is to secure enough to cover the construction costs required to get the unit move-in ready. The best time to bring it up is when you're still weighing your options, which gives you the opportunity to walk away if the landlord is not flexible. Key factors influencing negotiation. Length of the lease. A longer lease term typically provides tenants with greater leverage in negotiating higher allowance. Landlords are more likely to invest in improvements if they know the tenant will occupy the space for an extended period. Rent amount. Higher rental rates may provide tenants with more bargaining power for a higher allowance. Landlords are often willing to offer more generous allowances if they can recoup the cost through higher rent. Renewal options. Including options for lease renewals may make landlords more amenable to offering a higher allowance since they see the potential for a longer-term tenant. Market conditions. In high demand areas or prime retail locations, landlords may offer smaller tenant improvement allowances because they know they can easily lease the space to another tenant. Conversely, in less competitive or underdeveloped areas, landlords may offer larger TI allowances to attract tenants. Vacancy rates. If the property or area has higher vacancy rates, landlords are often more motivated to offer higher tenant improvement allowances to fill the space and generate income. Space condition. If the property is in shell condition, meaning it's unfinished, landlords may be willing to offer a higher improvement allowance to make the space tenant ready. On the other hand, the space is already in move-in condition, tenant improvement allowances may be smaller or limited. Tenants' financial stability. A tenant's financial health can influence tenant improvement allowance negotiations. Landlords are more likely to offer larger allowances to tenants with strong financials because they view them as lower risk and more likely to fulfill their lease obligations. Business track record. Multi-unit operators and well-known franchise brands with proven success may have more leverage in negotiations because landlords value the stability and visibility that established brands bring to a property. Landlords' capital expenditure strategy. Some landlords may have a greater willingness to invest in tenant improvement allowances if they are looking to attract high-quality, long-term tenants. However, other landlords might prioritize minimizing upfront capital expenditures and therefore offer lower allowances. Projected improvement costs. The estimated cost of the desired tenant improvements can influence how much landlords are willing to allocate. Tenants should present a clear and realistic estimate of the build-out cost to support their tenant improvement allowance request. Standard versus custom improvements. Landlords are more likely to cover standard improvements that would benefit future tenants as well. Custom improvements specific to tenants' business needs, such as branded decor or specialized equipment, may be harder to negotiate and may require the tenant to contribute more out of pocket. Future property value. Landlords may offer higher tenant improvement allowances if the improvements are likely to increase the property's long-term value or appeal to future tenants. If the improvements benefit the building as a whole, such as an HVAC upgrade or enhanced accessibility features, landlords may be more flexible.
Okay, we just had one question that came in that I think is interesting enough. I think the answer is no, but do landlords have to give a TI allowance? I think the answer is no. It's just a negotiation tactic, right? Or is it required?
Correct. Yes, they do not have to give it.
Yeah. Okay. It's just one way to get you to sign on with them. All right. Negotiation tips.
Negotiation tips. Okay. So the first thing you want to do is negotiate early before the lease is signed. Obviously, it is something that you're going to want documented in the lease agreement. So research and understand market conditions. Before entering negotiations, research typical tenant improvement amounts in the market where you're leasing. Speak with brokers or real estate professionals who know the local landscape and can provide insights into what other tenants are receiving. Excuse me. Understand what similar tenants are getting in terms of allowances or improvements and use that data to set realistic yet assertive expectations. Build a strong case with cost estimates. Prepare a detailed cost estimate for the improvements you need. Present a clear itemized list of necessary improvements along with the costs associated with each, so the landlord understands the value. If you're negotiating for custom build outs or specific needs, such as specialized equipment, specialized kitchens, or advanced technology, explain how those improvements add value to the property and support the business. Negotiate with a holistic approach. Instead of focusing solely on the tenant improvement allowance, consider it as part of the broader package that includes rent, lease term, and other concessions like free rent or renewal options. Sometimes landlords might be more willing to offer higher allowances if you're flexible on other aspects like rent escalations or a longer lease term. If the landlord is unwilling to increase the amount of the allowance, you can ask for other compensations such as a rent abatement or free rent for a few months to offset your upfront improvement costs. Leverage competition. If you are considering multiple locations, use the competition between landlords to your advantage. Let landlords know that you're exploring other properties and that a higher tenant improvement allowance is an important factor. When landlords understand that you have options, they may be more willing to negotiate and offer better terms to secure your tenants. Work with experienced professionals. A commercial real estate broker with experience in your industry can help negotiate on your behalf. Brokers understand what's reasonable to ask for in your market and can present your case more effectively to landlords. In addition, working with a real estate attorney ensures that the terms of the tenant improvement allowance are clearly defined in the lease and protects your interests in case of any disputes later. Make the case for future property value. Explain how the improvements you plan to make will add value to the property. If your upgrades make the space more functional, attractive, or marketable for future tenants, landlords may be more willing to cover a higher portion of the costs. For example, investing in energy efficient lighting, HVAC systems, or ADA compliant features can increase the long-term value of the space.
All right. Yeah, we've done past webinars and we have other lots of content on lease negotiation tips. So if anyone wants more information on that, obviously TIAs are just one tiny part of negotiating your lease. We've got lots of other educational resources we can share with you or point you to afterwards. This is just one piece of the package. So the next question, once you've negotiated it, how do you track it? That's the big problem, I think.
Tracking your tenant improvement allowances involves much more than just saving receipts. It's about staying on top of your budget, deadlines, and project scope to ensure you get the maximum value from the landlord's allowance while staying compliant with your lease terms. Sorry.
We're making you talk too much, Tina.
Yeah, it is a lot. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Frequent reconciliation against the lease keeps you on track, helps avoid surprises, and ensures you're making the most of your improvement funds. Here's what to keep an eye on. Track the total amount allocated for improvements across all of your locations. Know the specific amount per lease to avoid overspending or underspending. Most TI reimbursements are stated as a not to exceed or up to a certain amount. If you don't spend the total amount, you don't receive the full reimbursement. Collect and organize all invoices from contractors, architects, suppliers, and other service providers involved in the improvement process. These receipts will be required for reimbursement or future audits. If the project goes over or under budget, track these discrepancies. Knowing where you overspent or saved will help in future negotiations and project planning. Track key project milestones, such as when work is scheduled to begin, deadlines for completion, and the deadlines for submitting reimbursement. Missed deadlines can result in forfeiting part or all of the allowance. The lease should stipulate the time frame for submitting for reimbursement. It's also important to note that most leases stipulate a period of time permitted for the build out before rent starts. It's important to track those dates and keep construction on a timeline so you don't start paying rent before you can even utilize the space. Okay, so Leasecake essentially has two ways that we can track tenant improvement allowances. The first one is the financial aspect of it. Essentially, you just put in the amount of the reimbursement and the date received so that it can be properly accounted for in any of your financial reporting. I want to note that this is only if it's a cash reimbursement. If the reimbursement is in the form of a rent credit, that's going to be reflected on the rent schedule. The second way is tracking the actual request for reimbursement. And this is accomplished through creating custom events that you can utilize to kind of tailor the information that you want to see. This is a very brief snapshot, just to give you an idea of the capability. But essentially, you're going to give it an event name. If it's a required field, if it's recurring, if it's critical, associated lease clause, if you want to be able to go back and read the actual lease language, create a task. If there's anything that needs to be done to prep for requesting the allowance, like gathering all that documentation, you can create a separate task and then set a reminder however many days out you want. And this part is cut off partly for confidentiality reasons, but you can add team members that are to receive that reminder.
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing about Leasecake is it's completely customizable. This is just one custom event example. So you can send reminders to your team about anything, TIA allowances, or literally anything that has to do with your lease or your space. So it's just one example of that. Very cool and helpful. All right. What kind of mistakes do people make? Is it not tracking it?
The first one is going to be overestimating the amount the allowance is going to cover or underestimating project costs. Basically, errors or miscalculation in your budget. A longer than anticipated build out period. Remember that some, if not all, leases have a time frame for the build out before rent starts to accrue. You want to stay as close to that timeline as possible. Miscommunications with landlords and contractors. Communication will help keep the project on track. If there's an unavoidable delay outside of your control, communicate with the landlord and they may be agreeable to extending the time frame, but get it in writing. Legal and regulatory considerations that can impact tenant improvement allowance use. One thing that comes to mind here, because it's something I have personal experience with, is ADA compliance. When you go to pull permits, the agency that handles the permits may flag something and say it needs to be brought into ADA compliance. If that's not something that was in the original plan, it can increase your costs. So you want to be mindful of that. Missing the time frame for reimbursement or not having all required documentation or a combination of both. For example, Most landlords require lien waivers in order to get reimbursed. If you submit for reimbursement, missing those documents, and then have to go and try to backtrack, you may inadvertently miss the actual time frame to get reimbursement.
All right. What's the bottom line?
So tenant improvement allowances empower tenants to create the perfect unit in an already great location. Knowledge is power when it comes to understanding the relationship between tenant and landlord responsibilities. Keeping track of all the details of a new lease can be overwhelming, but that's where Leasecake can help.
All right. I mean, it makes sense. You have to be on top of it as the tenant. They're not going to come asking you to submit your reimbursement as a landlord. No one would think that would happen. So
No, the landlord is
proactive.
not going to remind you that you have to submit for that. So
Yeah. All right. Questions, please send them over. We had a couple come in. One of these you addressed at the beginning, but just to reiterate, how do landlords typically price the TIA? Did you say it was by square footage generally? Is it price per square foot?
that's generally how it's presented. Yes.
Okay. The next one, how is the allowance typically dispersed? Is it upfront? Is it reimbursed, or is it credited, or some combination?
Um, it's usually in the form of a reimbursement. I'd say that that's the most typical that we see, followed by as a rent credit, and very rarely have I seen where where a landlord will pay upfront for a tenant-led tenant improvement.
Okay. Righty, let's see what's next. What happens if the cost of improvements exceeds the allowance?
If the cost of improvements exceed the allowance,
I assume you just have to pay the
yeah,
extra.
if it's just to put this kind of bluntly, if it's just the tenant's poor planning and poor budgeting, unfortunately, the tenant's gonna have to just absorb that cost and not get reimbursed for it. If it's something that's a little bit more out of their control, maybe there was something that they uncovered during the construction process that they couldn't reasonably have known prior to that. Like if they found mold that was hidden that has to be abated, the landlord may be agreeable to covering some of that cost. But again, this goes back to how the communication is key, and you're going to want to, if you stumble into that kind of situation, start those conversations with the landlord early. I wouldn't just, do the work, have the remediation done, add it to the tag, the bottom line at the end, and ask your landlord for reimbursement. Start those conversations early.
That makes sense. Righty. Can unused TIAs be applied to rent or other expenses?
Typically, no. The lease is gonna state generally that the allowance amount is up to or not to exceed a certain amount, so it's gonna be the actual cost of the work, not to exceed, let's say, $100,000. So if the work comes in at, say, $90,000, that 10,000 is forfeited.
Okay. All right. What are the most common challenges tenants face when accessing or using TIAs?
This kind of goes to one of the last points I made in the mistakes to avoid. I'd say it's either not missing the deadline to request reimbursement or not having all the documentation in order, which then makes you miss the deadline for applying for reimbursement.
Yeah. All right. Got to stay organized and stay on top of your deadlines. That makes sense. All right. Well, thank you, Tina. That was lovely. If we didn't get to your questions, sorry.
I was just gonna say, there was one, I feel like you asked me the first part. Do landlords have to give a TI allowance? That you did ask me in the beginning. But the second part to that, what benefits do landlords have when giving a TI allowance? I feel like we did kind of touch on this a little bit in the webinar. Sometimes the space um, can be, after you as the tenant move out, more marketable to future tenants, especially if there's been some accessibility upgrades or energy efficiency upgrades that have been invested in the space, that then makes it more marketable, years down the road. So
Yeah, that makes sense. It benefits the landlord also if you're improving the space for everyone.
yeah.
All right. If we didn't get to your questions here, we can send you an email follow-up and get back to you with them. And thank you, Tina, so much for your help and your expertise. We have 2 more webinars coming up. If anyone's interested, I will be sending a follow-up along with the recording and links to those, but the topics are due diligence, preparing your franchise for private equity or another strategic investment. That's coming up on the 17th. And then in January, we've got another one on AI and how that can benefit or help your real estate. And I will be sending the links to both of those. But thank you so much, Tina. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we hope you have a lovely rest of your day.